Fire, cider, rain. 3 things I enjoy in moderation. The cover is quietly explosive, a waterfall of color in the clouds. The word rain sits just right on the horizon, especially the letter A. The title of the first poem snapped me into focus. Coefficients of Friction. Christ, didn't I get into poetry specifically to avoid these kinds of words? After a little Googling, I discovered that a coefficient of friction is simply a measure of the amount of friction between two surfaces. It's the resistance between two things. Underneath the title, there's a series of acronyms. I don't travel much, but I recognized the third as Toronto Pearson's airport code. After a little Googling, I discovered that this is an itinerary, Mauritius to France to Canada. Okay, let's get into the poem. Along a fibrous ridge of rain, the bodies converged. I have more questions, more Googling to do. What's a fibrous ridge of rain? Rain that resembles a mountain range of fibers? Is fibrous ridge medical jargon? And which bodies converged? And does the poetry require that I have answers to these questions? I proceeded through the collection, Googling furiously and taking notes. I think Ng asks a lot of the reader too early on. Fire, Cider, Rain begins with the collection's most experimental and challenging poem. It's also 7 pages long. The reviewer for Concordia's The Link felt a little put off too. She writes, some of the words Cheng Hin employs don't always make sense together on a literal level. She writes lines such as along a fibrous ridge of rain and watching seatbelt signs shudder in amber. Even though this bothered me at first, they mesh well sonically and aesthetically. The thing is, it usually takes me a couple poems to understand a poet, to learn how to read them. I hadn't learned to read Ng's work, so it wasn't opening up to me. But once I'd read about 30 pages, I felt settled in, and like having arrived in a new place, there was so much to see and think about. Some of these poems are engaging narratives, like The Turtle Behind the Cigarette Shop. Some poems are more minimalist, like When Waipo Died. And others are loose and exploratory, like Coefficients of Friction. Check out the variety of forms too. There's a poem that takes the form of dictionary entries, another formatted in 2 columns. Another one is formatted like ice shedding layers. That's how the author put it in an interview in the Malhat Review. There's even a recipe and a gap-happy poem. A poem with lots of gaps in it. I feel like there's another name for this sort of thing, but I don't know what it is. Ng changes her language too, depending on the needs of the form. So the dictionary entries and recipe both take on a cold instructional tone, but with warm poetic twists. There's also a lot of vocabulary I wouldn't normally encounter unless I'm chatting with my nurse friends or my uncle, who's a chemist. Words like soluble, spinal tap, litmus test, and distal. I recommend reading with a dictionary by your side, unless you play Scrabble and you're familiar with words like xeric and sinusoidal. I really liked some unusual word pairings: absence rinsed, overgrown dignity, pearled trees, phrenic defense, thoracic hymns. And if you believe, as I did before reading this collection, that medical jargon weighs down a poem, you'll be proven wrong. I wanted to suspend our quivering for one soluble second. Soluble works in 2 ways. The second is either dissolved or solved, a moment lost to eternity, or found and understood. Spinal Tap is the name of a mockumentary that I adored growing up as an angsty air guitaring teenager. But in this stanza, Spinal Tap, of course, is closer to its meaning as a procedure, a removal of fluid from the spine and the lower back. The clouds swiveled up the ragged coast, the spinal tap so swift. Here, spinal tap is a metaphor for the speed of the clouds moving up the coast, the removal of fluid from one patch of sky. If you're a poet seeking to branch out your style, this book will teach you how to use the phrase capillary action with confidence and originality. The language also highlights the collection's chief thematic concerns, the wisdom of the earth, of one's ancestry, and evolutionary history. Here's the first stanza from a poem titled Funeral. Hyaline surface of Lake Ontario swirls in the wake of a passing ferry. Hyaline means clear or transparent, but unlike either of those words, which are general and could apply to a wide range of substances, hyaline has a specific connotation in medical and biological fields. Thanks to ChatGPT for that info. It's as if Ng wants the reader to understand the natural world as a human body, and vice versa. More examples of this human nature synthesis. Lines like, the bloodlet of seasonal floods, buildings sway like orchids, the sea splits into biographies. The poem Dictionaries in the Sand provides standard definitions of natural phenomena alongside more personal associations. So we learn that rain is water that descends from the clouds continuously in a considerable quantity, but rain is also the following. In my late years, the ashes of a choking island fire returned to me in the form of Mama's voice. I say this of diasporic peoples. If you must exist anywhere, if you want to make a goddamn life for yourself, let that be in the space between rainstorms, trivial as rivulets on stiff clothing, blown in on a foiled wind. Notice too how the pronunciation of rain is mother. The death of the speaker's waipo, Chinese for maternal grandmother, permeates the collection, and this loss triggers a desire to explore what remains of the maternal lineage. But this descent is deeper than a family tree. It extends to trees themselves, to Mother Earth. It's as if, feeling uprooted by the recent loss, the speaker is searching her history and the history of the earth to anchor herself, to imagine a healing, generative way of life. Here are a couple examples of how ecology intersects with ancestry. Waipo presses floors to sleep, the anchors in her blood tightened by riparian blooms. When I tilt Waipo's ashes to the lake, they touch earth at the center of each of its abandoned tremors. The collection is divided into 4 sections. The first 3 are named after stages of the water cycle: evaporate, condensate, precipitate. And if you want to learn more about the connection between the water cycle and the themes explored in this book, check out Ng's interview in the Malahat Review, where she gives a really beautiful explanation. And there's a link provided in the description below to that. The last section is collect, a short prayer, words that gather one's thoughts into something whole. This last section comprises just one poem, the longest in the collection, and definitely one of my favorites. Here are a few excerpts for your interest. The ballerinas on screen sprout wings and flutter into the ceiling fan, where they burst into 2,000 feathers each. Why do we ascribe such unbound wisdom to dying bodies? I reach under her pillow in search of where your light leaks, and my hand falls through empty space. Your voice returns, Morse code in my walls, spins circles in the window pane. I have donned bodies, unlearned the signatures of rain clouds. Yet, no matter how often I fold my limbs into Quebec rivers, I cannot peel from my skin the layer that is you. Ultimately, Fire, Cider, Rain expanded my way of thinking about how precise, technical, scientific language can work in abstract, poetic ways. For me, it's one of those permission-giving books, opening the doors to ways of expression I had always considered off-limits for whatever reason. On top of that, there's a powerful exploration of what it means to be far from home and to yearn for a sense of belonging even within one's own family. I'm looking forward to revisiting that first poem, Coefficients of Friction, because there is now less friction between me and the book. Don't forget, this is all one person's opinion, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Until next time.